A new dawn came to Cap-de-la-Madeleine, and one of Our Lady's great shrines was born, in a strange way and at a totally unexpected moment. Things never looked darker to any pastor of the old parish than they did to Father Luc Desalais on the evening of the Feast of the Ascension, 1867. Father Desalais had come to the Cape 3 years previously. He was the sixth in the new line of resident pastors. None of his 5 predecessors had stayed more than a single 5-year term before leaving in defeat from the apathy or the active opposition of the parishioners. And now it looked very much as if the name of Father Luc Desalais was going to be added to the list of failures. This midsummer Wednesday had given him a long day to think of it. He remembered his arrival at the Cape in 1864. He had come to what should have been a prosperous parish, about 200 families, some 1,000 souls, all the inheritors of a great Christian tradition. Yet, out of those people, there were scarcely 10 who would listen to him. He had seen an official of the town gather the departing congregation outside church after service on a Sunday to make a speech against the priest. He knew that a certain amount of this was common at that time, but that did not account for the strange situation at Cap-de-la-Madeleine. The rest of French Canada had gone through the same trials, experienced the same political, social, and religious disturbances, but other places had shaken them off and asserted their inherent Catholic strength. The neighboring city of Three Rivers was now an episcopal see. The relatively recent parish of Drummondville, in which he had spent a year after ordination, was thriving. Why was the Cape so difficult? Even its long years without a pastor did not provide sufficient explanation. All through that time, the parish had been served from other centers by a series of missionary priests, among whom had been a high proportion of distinguished men. The Recollets, who first brought the gospel to the region, have returned to Canada and several times served Cap-de-la-Madeleine from their headquarters in Three Rivers. Jesuits had come from time to time from the downriver parish of Bécancour. One of them was drowned in the St. Lawrence on his way home from ministering to the parish of St. Madeleine. 5 different times it was a vicar general of the Archbishop of Quebec who came to minister to Cap-de-Madeleine. The last of these visiting missionaries had been Father Thomas Cook, who became the first bishop of Three Rivers and who had selected Father Luc Desalais to be his personal secretary and to attempt the revival of this difficult parish. In addition to this line of visiting priests, the dark years had always known a handful of devout and zealous souls who frequently appealed to the bishop for more priestly attention than they were getting. On at least one occasion, they had drawn a retort from the priest, concerned to the effect that they were getting much more attention than they deserved. Why then had its darkness been so complete, and why did it continue for so long? Father Desalais could find no answer. He had no way of knowing the divine plan for this special place, and he most certainly had no idea that he was the instrument chosen to carry it out. At that moment, he felt far from being a chosen instrument. He felt rather like an unprofitable servant. What good was a literary reputation which had won him the post of secretary to the bishop if he could not succeed at the one thing he had given his life to do, the work of a priest of God? And as dusk fell on the little presbytery, it told him clearly and distinctly all he already knew about the apathy of his parishioners and his absolute failure to do anything about it. For he had begged and implored his people to come to confession on the eve of this great feast of the Ascension. And here he was at nightfall, alone and waiting in vain by the confessional, as he had been all day. Not a man, woman, or child of the 1,000 in the village, all of whom he could name one by one, had paid the least attention to their pastor's pleading. His thoughts were not happy ones as he made his way slowly over to the little chapel to pour out his grief and his failure before the hidden Christ. He was a lonely figure as he passed with bowed head through the darkened doorway of the deserted little church. This, he must have thought, was rock bottom. It was, or at least it would be in another second. But it was also the moment Providence had ordained for the exact combination of person, place, and circumstance to make clear to the world Our Lady's message. The message a great pope was soon to spread broadcast over Christendom. In a series of 13 encyclicals, the message of the Rosary as a means of bringing men back to Christ through Mary, all the meaning of the Cape's past history and all the content of its yet hidden future were focused on this man entering this empty church at this moment, a devout, capable, and zealous priest, humble and humiliated, coming to God for an answer. A people that had once been gloriously Christian now turned away from the church, the fountain of living water, and resisting all the regular sustained effort of good pastors to bring it back. A moment when all ordinary hope seems to have died. But that moment had not yet let Father Disselette taste all its bitterness. The last insulting drop now came to fill his cup to overflowing. As he stepped inside the church, a scuffling sound drew his attention to the benches on the gospel side of the main altar. He raised his head and moved down the aisle, looking towards the noise. The sight that met his eyes must have been just all he needed at that moment. A great, dirty, snorting pig was scrambling on the step of the confraternity altar, the altar that held the statue known as miraculous. In the animal's ugly snout was a rosary, which it was chewing and dragging over the floor. Father Disselette rushed forward, rescued the rosary, and chased the pig out of the church. As he shooed the beast away with a hand that clutched the besodden beads, a single thought leapt to his mind. The people drop the rosary, and the pigs pick it up. He turned once more towards the tabernacle, genuflecting, and walked slowly forward. His eyes were still fixed on the door that hid the miracle of a God suffering neglect. As his knees found the step, he placed his arms on the communion rail and bowed his head into his hands. What Father Disselette prayed at that moment we shall never know. He was not given to leaving a record of his intimate spiritual experiences, and through all his writings, he retained a gentleman's reticence about his own part in the wonderful events that were to surround him. At first, he probably prayed that wordless prayer of perfect submission, which brings relief to hearts too full for speech. When he was able to sort out his thoughts, Our Lady had already taken him by the hand. This was her moment, the moment for which the Cape had been prepared through 200 years, the moment in which the shrine of Our Lady of the Cape was truly born. For Father Disselette's eyes had been opened to the significance of the neglected pair of beads he still held in his hands. It is most likely he returned to the little side altar of the Confraternity of the Rosary. He probably stood for a moment, looking at the altar, at the statue of her who had brought the Redeemer into the world, at the yellow and long unchained list of confraternity members hanging on the wall. A well-read man, his mind must have been flooded with all he had read about the wonders of spiritual rejuvenation accomplished through the confraternity, about the ancient history of the confraternity at the Cape, and about Father Butteau's use of the Rosary. We do know that he knelt and made a vow in the fulfillment of which he single-handedly founded Canada's shrine to the Queen of the Holy Rosary. He vowed that he would dedicate his life to spreading the confraternity and the recitation of the Rosary, not only in his own parish, but throughout the diocese and anywhere else his voice would be heard. He made the vow as only a humble and a holy man would make it. He vowed to start with himself. He would study the confraternity and the Rosary until he had learned all he could about it. He would pray it as it was intended to be prayed, then teach others to do the same. He also, like his divine master, took upon himself the fault of his people. He blamed himself for the state of the parish. The instrument of the Rosary had been in his hands since he arrived in this parish with its ancient confraternity, and he had not used it. In these things we may see Our Lady teaching another lesson as she grants us the great favor of her shrine. She wants us to come to her with trusting humility, looking into our own hearts and ready to take the obvious means placed within our hands. As Father Disselette closed the church and crossed over to the presbytery that stood about 100 feet in front of the door, no change had taken place in Cap-de-la-Madeleine. It was still the same village of neglectful Christians, There could have been no remotest thought in his mind that the vacant ground he was now crossing would be walked by millions of pilgrims coming to honor Our Lady in this place. There had only been a moment, if you will, of revelation and resolution. This was a clear-cut moment with an obvious situation to stand as a measure of its success or of its failure. Cap-de-la-Madeleine was a parish of lukewarm Catholics. Father Disselet was going to use the rosary as a weapon to restore the vitality of their faith. The situation of the parish was much like that of the whole Portuguese nation before Fatima, like that of a dozen once Christian countries today. If the rosary could restore the little world of Cap-de-la-Madeleine, there would be an exemplar in miniature for Portugal just 50 years later, and for Russia and all the former realms of Christendom, when enough people are ready to lead them back to Christ through the gate of heaven God chose to bring Christ to us. If the Cape came back to the fervor of its youth, the value of the rosary would have another striking proof. But at the moment, the outcome of the situation depended on one man, Luc Disselet, priest of the Diocese of Three Rivers, personal secretary to Bishop Thomas Cook, and pastor of the parish of Sainte Madeleine in Cap-de-la-Madeleine.